Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Laurie Regan, and I am the host of MEF's weekly podcasts. I want to thank you all for joining today and for your continued support of the work that we here at the Middle East Forum do. We couldn't do it without you, and we consider our supporters an integral part of our successes and our achievements. This afternoon, I'm joined by Sinan Ciddi, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the director of its Turkey program, who will be discussing Turkey's role in the Gaza ceasefire and its rebuilding. As I've mentioned previously, we are transitioning to a new streaming platform, and I ask for your patience with any glitches that may arise. The recording of this podcast will be available shortly, so please do share the link with those in your networks who you think would be interested in this very important topic. Welcome, Sinan, and thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, Dorian. Thanks for having me, and thank you to the Middle East Forum for making space and time for me. And it's a pleasure to speak to you all. And so today, I think we're going to speak about the topic of Turkey's involvement in the Gaza peace process or the ceasefire and the subsequent, essentially, time frame and sort of happenings since the ceasefire was signed and what Turkey seeks to do, the role it envisions for itself. And so after speaking to you, hopefully for 10, 15 minutes, I can sort of field some questions and see where we go from there. So we do know that the Trump administration has thanked his, President Erdogan of Turkey for playing an integral role in helping achieve the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas just several weeks ago that saw the cessation of hostilities between the two warring sides that has been waged for the last 2 years or more. And that has resulted in the handing over of Israeli hostages in return for, several thousand Hamas militants back to Hamas in Gaza. And since then, we've seen sort of a clear-up operation begin inside of Gaza itself. And now we're supposed to be moving to the sort of next phase of the process, which is supposed to result in a peace process. And sort of, we're not quite sure if it's going to happen or not. And you may ask yourselves the question, well, what role is Turkey supposed to have there? And it depends who you ask. But really, the situation is this. I think Turkey envisions for itself a pivotal role going forward. And this is something that is heavily resisted by Israel, but not just by Israel, but by also a number of Arab states, not least of all Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, as well as Egypt. And we do know that Egypt is actually in deliberation right now, trying to sort of talk with the Trump administration, saying, please keep the Turkish military outside of Gaza in every shape and form. This is not going to benefit anyone. And if you ask why, here's the reasoning. Because right now, yes, the Turks have proven integral to the achievement of ceasefire simply because Turkey has a relationship with Hamas, right? Turkey hosts Hamas as an organization inside of Turkey. Hamas's leadership has come and gone throughout Turkey in the last 2 years. In fact, outside of Qatar, Turkey probably has a larger Hamas infrastructure in terms of office space, hosting its leadership. They house the organization's fundraising infrastructure inside of Turkey that helps funnel billions of dollars to Gaza through Turkey's financial system. But also, it helps recruit militants and terrorists into Hamas through Turkey. But also, Turkey houses the West Bank crew of Hamas's organization, which has planned and carried out numerous terrorist attacks inside of Israel since 2011. So it's not a small footprint. But Turkey has also given sanctuary to Hamas leadership. It has given passports and travel documents and diplomatic cover to Hamas's leadership. But Erdogan himself has, patronized Hamas's leadership over the years. He has openly met with its leadership. He's called it a resistance movement. So we're not talking like a small footprint in terms of how much influence Turkey wields over Hamas as an entity. And therefore, they have proven integral in achieving a ceasefire because they basically told the Hamas leadership saying, unless you sign this ceasefire agreement, we cannot stand by you. And Qatar was also complicit in this. But now Turkey wants a larger part in this. And the reason why a handful of states, including Israel, are resisting Turkey's push for this is because Turkey's saying we want to position the Turkish military as part of a wider, a larger peacekeeping force that has been referred to in the ceasefire agreements or the Trump peace plan as the International Stabilization Force, the ISF, right, inside of Gaza, right, to essentially oversee this sort of two-state solution. And Turkey is a guarantor of Palestinians' safety and security going forward. And that is the major problem. And if your audience asks, well, what's the problem with that? Well, it depends, again, your perspective. But I think the countries that are resisting this, their major problem is this. Given Turkey's patronization of, or patronage of Hamas, right, you're not looking at an impartial and credible actor that seeks to achieve peace between Israel and Palestinians. You're looking at a Turkey, an Erdogan government, which is 100% a backer of Hamas, and it wants to see Hamas succeed and continue to succeed, because one of the problems in this peace plan is Hamas is refusing to disband and disarm. It wants to continue leading the state as a government, and this is not okay, obviously, with Israel, right? And Turkey wants to stand by its side militarily. And in such a scenario, if the Turkish military is positioned inside of Gaza with an armed presence, not least of all a NATO country with a NATO military capabilities alongside Hamas, then the problem becomes, from Israel's perspective and the Arab states' perspective that resist this, well, is Turkey going to be in a position to arm and reprovision Hamas on the one hand? And secondly, if conflict breaks out again between Israel and Hamas, is Turkey going to militarily assist and stand side by side with Hamas? Those are the problems, and then essentially you're looking at a far more deep-seated conflict between Israel and not Hamas, but Israel and Turkey, something that which observers have long been worried about, and I sort of outlined in a piece recently that I wrote for Haaretz newspaper, suggesting that this would prove to be the worst conflict that the Middle East has seen ever. And all that war between Israel and Turkey, because you would be looking at a conflict between, an Israeli military and NATO's second largest military, which has over 1.3 million armed personnel and quite sort of catastrophic capabilities. So that's where the problem is. Now, on the other hand, you would think that the United States and the Trump administration would be sympathetic to the sort of those who are suspicious and who would want to sort of say, hang on a minute, maybe we should not let the Turkish military be participate in this ISF, the stabilization forces, given these risk factors. It seems to be quite the opposite. The Trump administration is sympathetic to this, and we've seen sort of different opinions come out, both from the Secretary of State's office. We've seen different opinions coming out from U.S. ambassador to Ankara saying Turkey needs to be a part of this. It's a good faith actor, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the last few days, what we're seeing is suggesting that Turkey will be a part of this ISF, despite all these objections. And as a result of that, what we are worried about is if this happens, what will Israel's response be? But there's a lot of work in the background that is seeking to essentially diplomatically prevent this from happening. And Erdogan's government and the foreign minister of Turkey, in league with Qatar, are essentially trying to strong arm and elbow their way into saying, look, the Palestinian people want us there. We obviously feel for the plight of Palestinians, and we deserve to be there. Turkey's Humanitarian Relief Foundation, the IHH, which, if your audience is familiar with this organization, this is Turkey's equivalent of international FEMA in American parlance, is already on the ground providing relief in clear-up efforts. But IHH itself is also tainted. It has tenuous ties and provable ties to things like the Muslim Brotherhood and sanctioned entities under the Muslim Brotherhood sanctioned by the United States, and has a tenuous record of sponsoring aid flotillas in the past. It was part of the original 2010 Mavi Marmara flotilla. And so, Turkey's already in Gaza in relief effort manners, providing relief efforts. And you could say that Turkey deserves to basically just limit its activities there if it cares about Palestinian relief. But Erdogan wants more than that. Erdogan wants Turkey militarily and physically present inside of Gaza as a means to essentially push out Israel, and really sort of undermine its ability to dictate terms as to how this peace process or this peace plan is essentially conducted and prosecuted. Turkey feels it has a large voice. Erdogan recently said that Turkey ruled Jerusalem for 400 years, implying that it was a wonderful sort of haven under Ottoman rule, and therefore that it had some sort of historical responsibility, historical sort of mission to sort of fulfill an obligation to once again provide peace and calm. My argument would be to suggest that there are seldom, few people in the Middle East from various Arab states, including Arabs inside of Jerusalem or inside of Israel, present-day Israel, who would be ecstatic about welcoming Turkish rule back into the modern Middle East. But again, this is a larger sort of part of Erdogan's ambition to push itself back into to the Middle East. So that that this is where we sort of kind of sit right now, and unfortunately, what we're seeing is Erdogan seems to have a considerable amount of influence over the Trump administration in essentially elbowing his way in. And people will say, well, why is that the case? Given Erdogan's sort of, extensive ties to Hamas, a U.S. designated terrorist entity, why is the Trump administration humoring Erdogan? And those are very, valid questions. We also know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is not exactly Turkey's biggest fan. He has co-sponsored numerous pieces of legislation whilst he was senator, trying to sort of strengthen Mediterranean ties to isolate Turkey with countries such as Greece, Cyprus, Israel, not to mention other sort of Mediterranean entities. And Rubio is no sort of stranger to Turkey's expansionist militarist ambitions inside of the Middle East, and does not trust Erdogan as far as he can throw him. But nonetheless, Trump and the Trump White House and senior advisors to the president, we understand, are pretty enamored with Erdogan. And if you ask why, there are sort of several answers you can give. One is Erdogan is very good at whispering to Trump, um, you know, we can take a lot of troubles away from what you are concerned about the Middle East and basically take care of those troubles for you. So one of those is basically to say, look, you have serious security concerns inside of Syria, Syria's stabilization, peace in Syria, Syria's unity, the resurgence of ISIS, etc., etc. We can take care of that for you. Turkey's your ally and partner. We will essentially help secure that for you. And as a result of that, let us handle that for you. That's music to Trump's ears. And Erdogan's been whispering that for the last 12 months since Trump came to office. And Trump loves hearing that. A second sort of avenue, which Erdogan has sort of, burrowed his way into Trump's sort of good graces, is essentially the Ukraine-Russia war, whereby Turkey has said to Trump, look, we have a positive rapport with both Vladimir Putin as well as the Ukrainian government. And as a result of that, we can help offset mediation costs, peacekeeping force if necessary, but we can essentially really play a significant role that will sort of take the sort of burden sharing of responsibility off the US in this conflict for you also. And as a result of that, let us do more than our fair share, because we have a vested interest in also, peace and calm in this part of the world. And again, that's music to Trump's ears. And he would like nothing more to essentially offload that to Erdogan. And in return for that, there are other things that he's offered up to Trump, not least of all things like when Erdogan recently visited the White House in September, he has supposedly offered up to Trump things like rare earth mineral deals that Turkey supposedly has. And apparently Turkey has a significant amount of things like lithium, apparently a significant amount of deposits that were previously unknown, that he's willing to essentially work with the Trump administration as a sort of bargaining chip. And in return for all of these, Turkey wants some sort of access into the Gaza peace sort of process. And Trump is also looking at the Netanyahu administration as a way of saying, look, Netanyahu, you have not exactly been a party that's been interested in just fighting Hamas, but you've begun a forever war in this part of the world, and I'm kind of tired of this. And as a result, I'm going to also work with the Turks, and you're going to just essentially get on board with this. And so this is where we're at this point in time. And I think we're just going to have to wait and see to see how much access Erdogan gets. And we're essentially going to see if we can witness if Erdogan gets more than he can bite, and whether he gets to be a stabilizing force inside the Middle East, or if he's going to actually increase and heighten tensions that can perpetuate conflict in a way that nobody wants to see. So I'll stop there, hopefully, and see if we can press ahead with some questions on your end.
Well, first, I have to say thank you so much, Sinan, because that was unbelievably thorough. And I had come up with a whole list of questions for you, and you've answered so many of them. But I do want to, you did just a really broad brush covering everything. But we can delve deeper into some of these issues. Um, I guess, my first question was going to be about the Trump Erdogan discussions in the White House in September. And that led to Turkey playing a role in the ceasefire. Do you think that it was a quid pro quo where, Trump said, look, it's been 2 years. You got to get Hamas to release the hostages. If you do, I'm going to give you, full run of the Gaza Strip. Was it something like that that got Turkey to finally, we've been waiting 2 years, and Biden certainly didn't get the Qataris or Erdogan in Turkey to get involved with the release of the hostages. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Those
that's a really good
discussions.
question. That's a really good question, Lorraine. One of the things to sort of point out there is one of the things that the Biden administration did not do was to use Turkey as a resource in this. And I don't necessarily actually fault the Biden administration in this, because their policy was to basically keep Erdogan at arm's length. Right? I mean, Biden kept Erdogan at arm's length simply because, you know, he has experience working with Erdogan, not just as president, but also as vice president. And he knows Erdogan for the man he is. He deems him to be untrustworthy. He deems Erdogan to be essentially working against American interests, as somebody who is willing to play both sides, as in both work America, but also work, America's adversaries against America in terms of American interests, entities like Hamas, but also, Turkey's played both sides of the Ukraine-Russia war, really enabled the Russian war machine. So Biden was no idiot to this. And what that resulted in was essentially, if things needed to be, if Turkey needed to be relied upon for certain things, this happened between senior White House officials under the Biden administration and Erdogan. Biden didn't want to work with Turkey. Now, the downside of that was obviously that, when it came to the Middle East conflict, the Israel Hamas war, Turkey's relationship with Hamas couldn't be tapped. Now, depending on how moralistic a position one wants to take, Biden's position was like, I'm not going to, use Turkey as a means to essentially, gain access to sort of, getting, this ceasefire signed or even envisioned. That's a perspective, whether you agree with it or not. That's a perspective. But, Trump's perspective was like, I don't care about Turkey's relationship with Hamas or whether it considers a terrorist organization or not. I'm going to rely on that relationship to see if they can strong arm Hamas to laying down, stop the fighting on their end, that will help result in the release of hostages and the cessation of, fighting, so that it will help, possibly, that will lead to a longer term cessation of hostilities. Whether it results in peace or not, we'll have to see. And that's something that's resulted in, obviously, exactly the latter, which is the release of hostages. I think there's a deeper problem still there, in the sense that, we have an Erdogan, we have a NATO ally, the only NATO ally, that not only doesn't consider Hamas to be not a terrorist entity, but it's the only one that calls it a resistance movement and actively shields it. And that may become a problem for Erdogan down the line, especially if the Muslim Brotherhood is designated a terrorist organization. And what do we do with an entity, with an ally like that? So it's yielded a short-term result, but in the longer term of scheme of things, is like we have an ally on paper that considers a pretty nasty organization a resistance movement, something that we are horribly at odds with. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Thank you. Turning to the Israeli concerns, I think it was last month that Vice President Vance said during his visit to Israel that the U.S. wasn't going to force anything on our Israeli friends when it comes to foreign troops on their soil, but we do think there's a constructive role for the Turks to play. Um, Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, said that if, quote, we finally get rid of Iran and Hezbollah, and then we end up with Turkey, Qatar, and the Muslim Brotherhood inside Gaza, that would be a very dangerous situation. Does Israel have a say in who becomes a party to this ISF, and who is permitted to actually put troops on the ground? Will the Turks also be putting soldiers on the ground in Gaza?
I think that's the $1 million question. So what we're hearing being said by the vice president versus what's being said by the secretary of state versus what's been said by the U.S. ambassador to Ankara and special envoy to Syria, Tom Barak, who seems to be essentially running this portfolio, or in the case of Gaza, obviously it's more the case of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. I think there has been a considerable amount of uncertainty and ambiguity. In the last several days, the message seems to be getting clearer, although we'll still have to wait to see what happens. And that clarity seems to suggest that Turkey's military will be present inside of Gaza. But again, the Israelis are saying, absolutely not. This is more than a red line for us. And that if this happens, then they will resist sort of withdrawing their troops from Gaza. I think a lot of this you know, is TBD until it really does happen. I'd like to say that Israel does get to have a say, and as with many things in the Trump administration, it may come down to the last person who gets the president's ear. But I say unfortunately because I'm a person who advocates against Turkish military being present inside of Gaza because it presents a major security risk that could inflame a major sort of conflict. But for one reason or another, I think the president here is rather enamored with the Erdogan perspective and thinks that Turkey can play a constructive role in the stabilization force. But my counter argument would be to suggest, look, there are a plethora of Muslim states and countries that could field troops as part of this stabilization force. A plethora, most notably from the region, that could step up to confront this role, who don't have toxic credentials, as in being Hamas supporters, who have not essentially in the post-October 7 conflict thrown their lot into backing Hamas as an entity and called it a resistance movement, who have maybe been skeptical of Israel's sort of prosecution of the war against Hamas in the last year or so, and the Gaza war, but nonetheless have stopped short of saying, yeah, Hamas is a resistance movement. And that perspective is by and large enough for Israel to accept in terms of being willing to move forward with accepting stabilization force, militaries that would step in to sort of police that situation in conjunction with other nations, right? But Turkey is not one of those, right? And what the distinguishing feature of Turkey is, it is a patron of Hamas. It has never once, the Turkish president has never once condemned the October 7 attacks, right? He barely waited 3 weeks post October 7 to decry Israel, right? His foreign ministry put out a weak statement after October 7 saying, they're concerned about the loss of life on October 7. But Erdogan himself not once said this, right? And so, it is a fundamental lack of perspective and credibility and impartiality, and Turkey's sort of glaring expansionist and militarist aims in the region that sort of should put the U.S. president's mind on caution to say, look, we should employ other powers if we're serious about peace.
So I'm glad you mentioned Turkey's expansionist ambitions in the region. Excuse me. You wrote a piece, an essay in the In Focus magazine, Jewish Policy Center's magazine, on Turkey's role in the civil war in Syria, and Turkey's role over the years of that civil war in eventually overthrowing the Assad regime, with Erdogan's goal of remaking the region in his Islamist vision. So is this part of that expansion? What is Turkey's, you know, what are Turkey's long-term goals with this role, in addition to just rebuilding Gaza?
So yeah, I mean, it's a good reference point. I mean, yeah, many of us have suspected that Erdogan has, you know, not just regional but global ambitions to position Turkey as a major power. And you can cite whether it's Syria, whether it's the Mediterranean, but whether it's outreach towards Europe and how he positions himself against the Ukraine-Russia conflict as a security partner for Europe, but also just Turkey's military buildup as a military power. So if I just gave you one statistic, which would be to suggest that right now, the Turkish military is domestically involved in constructing 35 warships, which includes one aircraft carrier, right? Now, that total number of ship construction in Turkish shipyards, that is more than the entire European Union's arsenal of ships under construction. That is a massive shipbuilding capability. Europe in total does not have that capability. In fact, that's probably more shipbuilding capability currently than we have in the United States, in terms of defense industrial base. Turkey's drone building capabilities, its national tank, its national fighter plane building capability, its fifth gen capability that it's in prototype phase now. Turkey is on the precipice of becoming a major sort of military, sort of entrepreneurial sort of power that's becoming increasingly self-sufficient, all with the aim of basically saying, if I'm going to project power, I need to have my own capabilities that is independent of the United States and Western Europe. Although it's still largely dependent upon the US and Europe for advanced capabilities for now. But it may become increasingly, if not totally independent, by the mid-2030s. And to what aim? Well, with the fall of the Assad regime inside of Syria, and with Iran's weakening as a result of that, its hold on Syria, and Russia's withdrawal from there, what we have seen is, the Shara regime or the Jalani regime move into there. And what's interesting about that is the Shara regime is a regime that was 100% nurtured and raised and supported by Erdogan for years. From Erdogan's perspective, Shara is his boy. And he has come and gone through Turkey numerous times. There are approximately 20, or some estimates put 30,000 Turkish troops inside and present within northwestern Syria right now. They've also reached agreements now to train Syria's new military, in air quotes, in Turkish military academies. They're also interested in provisioning Syria's military, but they're also interested in expanding Turkey's military footprint inside of Syria to fill the void left by Iran and Russia, right? And they're not planning to leave anytime soon. And this even likely means, even if the Shara regime collapses or Shara is taken out, the likelihood of Turkey's military just voluntarily leaving Syria is highly unlikely. They're there to stay, because they're basically saying, this is a part of the world that once Iran was essentially influential and powerful in. The big game is now us. And so that's territorial expansion, but they're also seeking to use that territory to essentially project further power, both commercial as well as political as well as military power. They're seeking to monetize Syria's fossil fuel industry, both on land but also offshore, and pipe those fossil fuel resources through the Mediterranean, through Turkey, to Western Europe to bypass Russian resources. So Turkey essentially becomes another sort of energy hub that's an alternative to Russia, which would make the country much more attractive to Western European eyes. But in doing so, by enlarging its military footprint inside of Syria, it also undermines Israel's projection of power, because if you look at how Israel positions itself now, it's also militarily very stretched. Wars with Lebanon, wars with Iran, Hamas, potentially Syria, right? The Israeli military is very thin. It's stretched. Its numbers are considerably smaller than Turkey's. And despite despite its military accomplishments in the last 2 years, the other sort of aspect that Erdogan is very much sort of burrowed in on is Israel's international image. Unfortunately, has been tarnished quite a bit in the last 2 years, and Erdogan is no stranger to trying to sort of exploit that to the maximum effect. And if he gets his way in Gaza by positioning Turkish military inside there, he's also going to run the table and try to say, well, I'm also going to project power from inside of Gaza too. And Turkey also has military basing outside of Turkey too. So it has forward military basing in places like Somalia, in places like Qatar, right, where Turkish military troops are forward deployed, right? The Achilles heel of Turkey in seeking to achieve these expansionist goals, unfortunately for Turkey, or fortunately for us, maybe, is Turkey's economically weak, right? It has the military might and muscle, and Erdogan's sort of steadfast dedication to achieving this, but its economy is very weak. It's heavily debt burdened. Turkey runs about the third highest consumer inflation in the world, but also Erdogan is very frail. He's 71 years old, but he looks increasingly frail, and he could pass away tomorrow, the next day, next month, next year, but I don't expect him to last until the next presidential election of 2028. And there are already sort of these hot, rife rumors about succession and who could succeed him and blah, blah, blah. But the problem is, Turkey may not be in a position to reach its political ambitions post Erdogan.
That's a fascinating way to end. I wish we had another half an hour to continue to discuss the future of Turkey, but we'll have to have you back another time to do that, Sinan. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us this afternoon. It was unbelievably informative. Please follow Sinan's work. I follow you on X and your work at FDD's website. Is there someplace else, Sinan, where people should be looking
It's
for your
about it.
work?
I mean, you
Okay.
get enough of me after a while, but thank you for having me.
Yes. Well, thank you. And I look forward to seeing everybody on Wednesday with MEF's Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. So I hope you all can join us for that and wish you all a wonderful